Good morning, afternoon, or evening. Welcome to IdiOtBoOks. I'm Idiot Dad, or IdiOtBuRNs. Today, we are reading an illustrated, abridged version of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. Who's Mark Twain? Well, we'll find out about the author, and he was Samuel Langhorne Clemens, and that's how he was born. And he was born in Florida, Missouri. So the city of Florida and Missouri, the state, in 1835. Although he left school when he was only 12 years old, he became a man of many interests and occupations. He began his career as a printer, then became a pilot of a riverboat, and afterwards he worked as a journalist, travel writer, and publisher. Clemens decided to use a pen name, Mark Twain, which came from Clemens' riverboat days, when measuring the depth of the water was called marking the Twain. Twain had been described as a hot-tempered and cynical, but also was tender and sentimental. His love for the past and his feelings for his country helped him produce some of his finest books. He also wrote The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Yeah. Chapter 1. Huck's New Life. You might have heard of me if you read The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. My name is Huckleberry Finn. I have always lived in this same little town of St. Petersburg, Missouri. My father is the town drunk and isn't around much, so I've spent most of my life fishing on the banks of Mississippi, sleeping in doorways, and having great adventures with my friend Tom Sawyer. Here he is. He's fishing. Things were always pretty dull around here until Tom and I discovered hidden treasure. We found $12,000 in gold. It was money that had been buried by robbers, so Judge Thatcher decided it was rightfully ours. Tom and I got $6,000 apiece. The judge put the money in the bank for us, and we got an allowance of $1 a day. For us, in that little town, it was more money than we knew what to do with. But the money didn't make me happy. About this time, the widow Douglas decided to take me in and raise me as her own son. She was kinda grateful, I guess, 'cause I helped save her life. But it was rough living in the house all the time. The widow made me wash and dress up and eat all my meals at regular hours. She even took me to church. When I couldn't stand it anymore, I ran away and got into my old rags. Then I felt free and I felt happy. Tom Sawyer hunted me up and said he was going to start a club. And here's the widow taking him to church. And I could only be a member if I went back to living a respectable life with the widow Douglas. So I went back, and the widow cried over me, calling me a poor lost lamb. She put me in a new suit of clothes that made me feel uncomfortable and sweaty all over again. I had the hardest time getting used to regular meals and polite talk. Then there was Miss Watson, the widow's sister, who had just come to live with her. She took an immediate interest in me and tried to teach me to read and spell. These lessons just made me tired and lonesome. By and by, she would send me to bed with a piece of candle for light. One night after my lesson, I felt so unhappy there, I wished I was dead. I sat in a quiet house and listened for the sound of the wind or the rustle of the trees. After a while, I heard a meow, meow, coming from beneath my window. Here he is. Lessons make him so tired. Coming from beneath his window. It was Tom's signal. He had called a midnight meeting of our club. I answered his signal with a meow. Then I slipped into my clothes very quietly and was out the window in a flash. We all met by a clump of bushes not far from the widow's house. There was me, and Tom, and Ben Rogers, and Tommy Barnes, and Joe Harper. We talked for a little while, and then we all took an oath of loyalty to the club. We elected Tom captain and Joe Harper second captain, and then we started home. I climbed up the shed and crept into my window just before daybreak. My new clothes were greased up and full of clay, and I was dog-tired. There they are taking an oath of loyalty. So that was the first chapter. Now we're on the second chapter. Nice day today. Second chapter is called Pap Returns. Well, I got a good going over in the morning from old Miss Watson because of my clothes, but the widow didn't scold me. She just cleaned off the grease and clay and looked so sorry that I thought I would behave if I could, at least for a little while. After 3 or 4 months had passed, our little club broke up, and we all started school again. It was the first time for me, but I could already spell and read and write, and do a little arithmetic. At first, I hated school. There's a picture of the widow cleaning his clothes contently. Itchy nose. At first, I hated school, but the more I went, the easier it got. I sort of got used to the widow's ways, but living in a house and sleeping in a bed made me feel a little too civilized. So before the cold weather came on, I slept outside whenever I could slip away. I made the house easier to take. One morning, I happened to drop the salt shaker at breakfast. This was sure to be my bad luck day. I went down to the front yard and climbed over the high board fence. There was an inch of new snow on the ground, and I stopped when I saw some fresh tracks. Whoever made them had come up from the quarry, stood around the fence for a while, then went around the garden. It was funny he hadn't come in after standing around. I couldn't figure it out. It was very strange somehow. I was about to follow the tracks when something stopped me. The impression made in the snow, made by the left boot heel, was in the shape of a cross. Here he is, fresh tracks in the snow. It was in the shape of a cross. It was formed by 2 big nails embedded crossways into the heel. A good luck sign? I had seen that heel print before. Suddenly, I was up and running down the hill as fast as my legs could carry me. I looked over my shoulder every few seconds, but I didn't see anyone. I reached Judge Thatcher's house in a few minutes. "Why, Huck, you're all out of breath," he said as he opened the door. "Did you come for your interest?" "No, sir," I answered. "Is there some?" "Oh, yes. A half-yearly check came in just last night. Over $150. Quite a fortune for you. You had better let me invest it for you, along with your $6,000. "No, sir," I explained breathlessly. "I don't want to invest it. I want you to take it, the interest, and the $6,000 too." The judge looked surprised. He couldn't figure me out. "Why do you want me to take it, Huck? What can you mean by giving away all of your money like this?" And here he is when he's seeing the heel and realizing, what? Whoa. all of your money like this? Please, don't ask me any more questions, sir. I know what I am doing, all right? After a while, I convinced the judge that I meant what I said. He asked me to sign a paper to make it all legal. I did it and left. I hurried back to the widow's. At least there, I'd be safe. Once inside, I lit my candle and went up to my room. I shut the door and breathed a big sigh of relief. But then, I turned around. There he was, Pap. I used to be scared of him all the time because he hit me so much when he was drunk and all. But now, I took a good look at the old man, and he didn't look that frightening at all. He was almost 50, and he looked it. His hair was long and black, no gray, but it was tangled and greasy and hugged down into his long, mixed-up whiskers. You could see his eyes shining through, like he was behind vines. Here he is, Huck, signing the papers with the Judge Thatcher. There wasn't any color in his face. It was white, but not like other man's white. It was a white that could make a person sick. A white to make a person's flesh crawl. He was sitting on my bed with one ankle resting on the other knee. The boot on his raised foot was busted, and 2 of his toes stuck through. His clothes were all in rags, and his old black slouch hat with the top caved in was laying on the floor near his feet. We stared at each other. Then Pap looked me up and down. "Fancy clothes you got there," he said. "You think you're a big shot now, don't you?" "Maybe I am, and maybe I'm not," I answered. "Don't you give me any of your lip," he snorted. You've put on airs since I've been away. I'll take you down a peg or two before I'm done with you. I hear you can read and write now, too. I bet you think you're better than your own father, don't you? Who told you you could meddle with such foolishness, huh? Who told you?" And here's his dad sitting there in his room on the end of his bed. I explained to Pap that the widow made me learn how to read and write and dress and live like a civilized human being. "It's that widow out to steal my son," he cried. "But no mind. Where's the money?" I told him that I gave it all to Judge Thatcher, but he didn't believe me. "I'll go see the judge," he said angrily, "and I'll find out where the money is and get my hands on it one way or another." Then he made me empty my pockets, and he took the $1 the judge had given me. I knew he'd go downtown to buy some whiskey. The next day, he was drunk, and he went to see Judge Thatcher. He shouted and threatened that he'd get the law on the judge if he didn't give him the money. When the judge refused, Pap went to court. Here's Pap making him empty his pockets. All right, chapter 3. Everything's recording. Good. Chapter 3 is Itchy Nose. Chapter 3 is called, no, not Itchy Nose, it's called Escape. The trial went slowly, so every now and then I had to borrow some money from the judge to give to Pap. Whenever he got money, he got drunk and made a big commotion in town, and he was thrown in jail. This happened again and again. He got to hanging around the widow's so much that he told him if he didn't quit it, she would make trouble for him. This got the old man real angry, so he watched for me, and one day in the spring, he grabbed me. He took me upriver about 3 miles. There he is, getting grabbed. He grabbed me. And he crossed over the Illinois shore where it was woody and deserted with no houses. We walked through the woods until we came to the old log cabin where we once lived. For the next few months, we lived on the food we hunted and fished. Every once in a while, Pap locked me in the cabin and went to the store to trade fish and game for whiskey. He'd fetch it home and get drunk. Then he'd lock the door at night and put the key under his head alongside his gun. But by and by, Pap got too handy with his belt when he got drunk, and I couldn't stand it. I was covered with welts. He got to going away a lot, too. He would lock me in the cabin so I couldn't escape. Once he locked me in, and he was gone for 3 days. I was terribly lonesome and scared. I thought maybe he had drowned, and I wasn't sure if I would ever get out again. I had to figure out some way to escape. I had tried to get out of the cabin many a time, but I just couldn't figure out how. And here he is, heading for the old log cabin, getting pulled into the old log cabin. There he is. Woo! Man. Come on, Pap. There we go. When Pap was away, he was pretty careful not to leave a knife or anything in the cabin for me to cut through the floor. The windows weren't big enough for even a dog to get through. The chimney was narrow to climb up, and the door was made of thick oak slabs. Finally, I found an old rusty saw with a broken handle. I fixed the handle, and I looked for a place to start sawing. There, behind a table at the far end of the cabin, was an old horse blanket nailed against the long wall. I got under the table, raised the blanket, and went to work sawing out a section of the big bottom log for me to escape through. Well, it was a long job, but I was getting towards the end when I heard Papa's gun in the woods. I got rid of the signs of my work. I dropped the blanket over the hole and hid my saw. Pretty soon, Pap came in. Here he is sawing his way. Wow, Jeff. Didn't even see it. Like, wow. He was in his usual mood, a bad one. He said he had been downtown and everything was going wrong. His lawyer said the trial would take a long time and there would be no money until the court made a decision. Meanwhile, the widow had been looking for me. She had sent a man to try to follow Pap, but Pap drove him off with his shotgun. After that, he threatened to hide me in another place where no one would find me. So I decided that if I could keep Pap and the widow from trying to find me, then I would really be free. After we had dinner, Pap locked me up in the cabin and went back to town. I judged he wouldn't come back that night, so I waited until he had a good start. Then I pulled out my saw. Before he was on the other side of the river, the hole was finished, and I was out. I knew there was an old canoe tied, get the next page, up on the shore. So I took a sack of cornmeal, a side of bacon, some sugar and coffee, and headed down to the river. Here's Pap shooting the shotgun to scare someone off. I filled the canoe with string, matches, a tin cup, and some blankets. Then I went back to the cabin and covered up the hole I had made. As part of my plan, I took Pap's shotgun from its hiding place. Then went into the woods and shot a pig. I found Pap's axe and used it to smash the cabin door to bits. Next, I fetched the pig inside, cut open its throat, and let its blood to make a trail wherever I dragged it. Then I pulled out some of my hair and stuck it to the axe onto the cabin door, and the whole thing looked like someone who hacked his way into the cabin and killed me and dragged my body off somewhere. When it was drunk, I moved the canoe down the river and waited for some willows for the moon under some willows for the moon to rise. I took a bite to eat. Here he is with the pig and the saw and the axe and the hair on the door. I took a bite to eat, and by I laid down in the canoe to smoke my pipe and figure out my plan. I knew that the townspeople would drag the river for my body, but they would soon get tired of that. Maybe they would hunt for the robbers who broke into the cabin. But right now, I needed to find some place to hide. So I decided to head for Jackson's Island. I knew the place pretty well. When the moon rose, I pushed off in the canoe. Soon I was on my way. It didn't take long to get to the island. Once I landed and tied up my canoe, I headed for the big log at the head of the island. From there, I could see way over the town, 3 miles away. Lights were twinkling, and if I closed my eyes, I could almost see the widow Douglas inside the big house on the hill. There was a little gray in the sky now as dawn came on, so I stepped into the woods and laid down for a nap before breakfast. Here he's pushing off the shore. Can't see anything out here. Just hear it. It's way out there. Finding Jim. Chapter 4. Double check it's still going. And it is. Yeah, that's right. Chapter 4 is called Finding Jim. The sun was so high in the sky when I woke up that I figured it was after 8 o'clock. I lay there in the grass in the cool shade, looking up at the sun through the holes in the branches. I felt rested and satisfied. A couple of squirrels sat on a limb and jabbered at me in a friendly way. I was lazy and comfortable and didn't even want to get up to cook breakfast, so I started dozing off again. When suddenly I heard a deep booming sound. It came from way up the river. I sat up and rested on my elbow. Here he is, rested and satisfied right here. I rested on my elbow, listening. Pretty soon I heard it again. I jumped up and ran down to the river. A ferry boat full of people was heading towards the island. Suddenly I knew what was happening. They were firing a cannon over the water because they believed it would make a drowned body come to the top. And they were searching for mine. I stood hidden in the bushes, watching the cannon smoke and listening to the booms. I lit a pipe and had a good long smoke while I went on watching. By and by, the boat drifted so close to the shore that I could have almost touched it. I saw most everybody on the boat. Pap and Judge Thatcher, Joe Harper, and Tom Sawyer, and plenty more. I could hear them all talking about a murder. My murder. Suddenly the captain called out, "Look sharp now! The current sets in the closest here. And maybe he's washed ashore and got tangled amongst the brush at the water's edge. I hope so, anyway." Here's Huck spying on the ferry boat. It's firing a cannon. I didn't hope so. Everybody crowded up and leaned over the rails, nearly in my face. They kept still, watching with all their might. They are looking and watching. When they didn't find anything, they gave up and headed back towards town. I knew I was all right now. Nobody else would come hunting for me. I got my traps out of the canoe and made a nice camp in the thick woods. I set up a tent out of my blankets so I'd have a place to put my things where the rain couldn't get at them. Then I caught a catfish and roasted it over a fire. When it was dark, I sat by my campfire, smoking and feeling pretty well satisfied. After a while, it got sort of lonesome, so I listened to the current washing along and counted the stars until I fell asleep. And so it was for 3 days and nights. No difference, just the same thing. But on the 4th day, I went exploring around the island, my island. I was the boss of it. It all belonged to me, so to say, and I wanted to know all about it. I was walking along when all of a sudden, in the clearing, I bounded right onto the ashes of a campfire. They were still warm. My heart jumped up into my lungs. I never waited to look further, but uncocked my gun and went sneaking back to my camp as quiet and as fast as I could. Every now and then I stopped for a second amongst the thick leaves and listened again. As soon as I got back to camp, I put out the fire, hid my traps, and climbed up in a tree. I reckoned I was up in there for 2 hours, but I didn't see or hear a thing. Well, I couldn't stay up there forever, so at last I climbed down, and by that time it was dark, and I was pretty hungry, but I didn't dare make fire, so I went to sleep hungry. There he is, finding that campfire. I didn't sleep much. I couldn't somehow, because I was thinking all the time. By and by, I said to myself, I can't live this way. I'm going to find out who's here on my island with me. I'll find out, or I'll bust. So I began searching all around the island, and after a while, I caught a glimpse of a fire through the trees. I went towards it, slowly and cautiously. Soon, I was close enough to have a look, and there, on the ground, lay a man. He had a blanket over most of his body, and his head was nearly in the fire. Pretty soon he yawned and stretched. Then he threw off the blanket. It was Jim, Miss Watson's slave. At that time, in Missouri, it was still legal to have slaves, and Jim and I had gotten to be friends, and when I had lived at the widow's house. I sure was glad to see him. "Hello, Jim," I said, skipping out of the bushes. Here's Jim, Miss Watson's slave. He jumped up and stared at me with a wild look. Then he dropped down on his knees and gasped, "Don't hurt me, don't! I never heard of ghosts. I always like dead people. You go get back in the river where you belong." Well, it took some talking, but I finally made him understand that I wasn't dead. I was ever so glad to see Jim. I wasn't lonesome now. I talked on and on, telling Jim everything that had happened to me. But Jim only sat there looking at me and never saying one word. Finally, we went over to where the canoe was tied up, and Jim built a fire in a grassy, open place among the trees. I fetched some meal, bacon, coffee, and sugar from the boat. We cooked breakfast, and when it was ready, we lolled on the grass and ate it. Jim laid into it with all of his might, for he was almost starved. Then, when he had gotten pretty well stuffed, he relaxed, and here he is going, "Don't hurt me," thinking it's a ghost. Ah, what? He said, "Listen here, Huck. I've got to tell you why I'm here, but you must never tell a soul." After I promised, Jim told me his story. "Well, Huck, I had to run off," he said. "Miss Watson, she picked on me all the time and treated me poorly, but she always said she wouldn't sell me down to New Orleans. But I noticed there was a slave trader around and the place a lot, and I began to get uneasy. Well, one night I crept home late and I heard Miss Watson tell the widow that she was going to sell me down to New Orleans for $800. It was so much money, she just couldn't resist. The widow tried to talk her out of it, but I got so scared. I never waited to hear the rest. I lit out mighty quick, I tell you. For the past week, Jim was in hiding too. We both agreed that it was good to have our company, and we set about fishing for our lunch." There's Jim telling him why he ran away. He didn't want to go to the South where there's still lots and lots of slave owners. Lots of work. Chapter 5 is The Woman Helps Huck. A catfish as big as a man? What? Let's see what happens. We'll read that one soon. We'll get back to this book very soon.